Thanks for having me here again. Noting that there's ice water here, when I gave this at the environmental conference, at the end of it, I was just talking like this. I didn't realize there was water right next to me. So also at the environmental conference, I'm going to treat this like a TED talk and just kind of like walk around. I didn't realize, at the environmental conference, there's a lot of environmentalists there, and I didn't need to explain the fact that Textile actually has archaeologists on staff. It's probably a little more pressing that I do so here. So yes, Textile has 10 archaeologists. We cover the entire state. We're not like California. We don't do all the archaeology ourselves. Oftentimes we manage work authorizations. We work with the consulting community. We also have biologists, hazmat specialists. Anytime we have a project, we need to consider the environmental impact, so we have a team of specialists that work with our engineers and our planners, right-of-way people, to keep Textile compliant with state and federal environmental laws and ensure our projects go smoothly, and if we are taken to court, that we are at least in a position to win. Sounds like we're doing pretty well with that, actually. So this particular project is in downtown Houston. If you're anybody familiar with the area, it's about 2 blocks north of Minute Maid Park, the ball field, which today is the location of a small park, James Butte Park. Oftentimes it's a homeless camp. And Textile is replacing a bridge at the Elysian Street Viaduct that was built in the 1950s. The project itself goes from Brook Street to Commerce Street. It's currently underway. There's demolition going on right now. We're having probably the same kind of negotiation problems with the railroad that we normally have. So it really looks like downtown Rome right now. We've got parts of the bridge still kind of up and hanging there, where everything on the other sides of it has been torn down. We're waiting for the rest of the bridge to be demolished so we can get and work in some of the areas that we weren't able to yet. The project itself has been going on for quite some time. We knew as early as the 1980s that the bridge was imminently needed to be replaced. And the first archaeology occurred actually in 2006. We did the first surveys then. And the surveys in 2006 were just meant to determine whether there was any part of Frosttown that remained. Frosttown was the first settled community in Houston, the first neighborhood, if you will. Well, the reason it's been going on for so long is there's been design changes. At first, we were just going to replace the bridge, elevated the way it is right now, and the business community got involved and wanted it at grade. So it's been delayed. Right-of-way acquisition has delayed things. So we're actually just doing the data recoveries just last year and this year. So here's a photograph in blue of where this is. In downtown Houston, you see Buffalo Bayou kind of circles around it. It's in a horseshoe bend of Buffalo Bayou. And on the right, you can see where the 8 blocks that were originally Frosttown are laid out with respect to where the viaduct is, or the project area. So, the origins of Frosttown date really to the 1820s. It was when Jonathan Frost first moved to that area, living on property that was owned by the Allen brothers, who acquired the property from the Stephen F. Austin land grant. This area was settled because it was a prominent turning basin where White Oak Bayou and Buffalo Bayou come together at Allen's Landing, just less than a mile, about a quarter of a mile up the river. Steamboats could come up from Galveston Bay, travel up Buffalo Bayou, turn around right there, so it became a port for commerce, and that was one of the kind of the early economic foundations of the city of Houston. It's what drove a lot of the industry, the fact that we had this great port and we could import things from all over the world and then ship them inland to other states. So Jonathan Frost actually bought this property in 1837, and then, like many people in early Houston, died of cholera later that year. Not lucky for him. His brother acquired the properties and divided it up into 96 lots, and in 1838 began to advertise these lots for sale for working class families to come and settle in. And the advantage for working class families is this was right near an area of Houston that was starting to develop sort of an industrial character. You had at that time the loading docks for the steamboats coming in. Eventually you had the lumber industry, the cotton industry, the cotton compress right there. And land was actually fairly cheap. And what makes this the first community is the first area in Houston that wasn't just kind of a farmstead with a landowner living on it, but it was actually working class families that lived right there and worked in this area of Houston. And the first people that began really immigrating in numbers were the Germans. This was after the Napoleonic Wars. There was still a lot of fractionation throughout Europe, and you had a lot of immigration coming into the New World. Where I'm from, New England, if you notice an accent at all. You had a lot of Italians and a lot of Irish. There were a lot of Irish here also in Texas, and a lot of Germans. Germans were the predominant group that started settling in Frosttown in the 1830s. And you can see some of the early maps. The first time Frosttown is ever mapped is in the Girard map of 1839. You can see just sort of how these lots were first laid out. And then in the Wood map of 1869, you start seeing it somewhat settle. And then you have the 1873 bird's eye map, and you can see it's somewhat sparse. It does start filling in after a while. And you have the railroad that actually went through in the 1850s. We'll talk about that in a second. So you had these working class families, predominantly German, also Irish, English, coming into the area. And these were immigrant families that, like many immigrants coming into the country today, are looking for opportunities that they don't have in their host countries, or in their home countries, rather. So this is, on the top, the 1891 bird's eye view, and yeah, you can see Frosttown right here is a blow-up of it, and it's really starting to settle, fill in a lot more. The architecture was working class, so it's like these German clapboard houses. There were, by the 1840s, you had at least 75 German families that lived in there. Now, the architecture changes over time. We'll see that. Some of the first major changes that occur in the community are in the 1850s when you have the railroad first go in, and it sort of cuts out part of these blocks, and it separates kind of this lower half of Frosttown from the rest of the community. And really, it sets into motion two things. One is the industrialization of the second ward. So it's this area just south of the bayou and into the east. The fifth ward, just on the other side of the bayou, also starts to industrialize. And it also brings about the sort of economic decline of the Frosttown community. People don't like to live near railroads for the most part, but it keeps its working class character. If you look at so the Houston City Directories used to be very invasive in a sense, that it didn't just list you and where you lived, but what your occupation was. It'd be problematic to do that now since people change their occupation so frequently, but maybe a lot of people also wouldn't want to donate this information. But when we only had a couple thousand people living in Houston, this was the kind of detail that you could actually get. But look at the character of the people that are playing here, that are living here. This is everybody that lived in Frosttown that had their occupation listed in the 1867 to 1868 city directories. You have Teamsters, draymen, night policemen, carpenters, machinists, painters, conductors of the railroad. A lot of people worked in the railroad. painters, porters, blacksmiths, butchers, watchmakers, barbers, very, very working class. These are not the people that you read about in any of the histories of Houston. These are not the business owners for the most part. These are not the city founders that owned a lot of the land and a lot of the shops. These aren't the first millionaires of Houston, the people that developed the oil industry. These are the people that worked in all the businesses whose labor built the city. Crosstown went through a number of demographic transitions, and you can look at those in a historical context. After the Civil War and emancipation, you had Crosstown become one of the first communities in the Houston area where blacks settled and opened some of the first African American businesses. Also, just over on the other side of the bayou, in the 5th Ward, that was another area where African Americans first came, first settled, first found opportunities beyond slavery and opened some of the first businesses and really started to develop an identity. Then, after the revolution in Mexico, in the early part of the 20th century, you had a lot of Mexicans move into large urban areas in Texas looking for opportunity, looking to get away from the warfare, strife, and lack of any opportunity that existed at that time in Mexico. And Crosstown was another area that they began to settle in, mostly in the 1920s and 1930s. In fact, by the 1930s, it was predominantly a Hispanic community. And it also, by that time, lost the name Crosstown. No one used that name. They called it Barrio Alacran, or the Scorpion neighborhood. So Crosstown's working class character never did change through time. It was a place that people could live cheaply, find opportunity in nearby industries, and by that time you had breweries, the ice house, the railroads, the cotton compress, you had the ship channel, all number of accessible areas of work opportunities that were in a walking distance or closely nearby. So it was very convenient for them, and the area began to develop industrially more and more after that. The demise of Crosstown finally began really in the 1950s when we built the Elysian Viaduct. It was exacerbated later in the 1950s when we built I-59. And the first of the last houses were finally taken away in the 1990s. Where just a few kind of shotgun shacks remained. So archaeologically, we wanted to know what is left of the community. And so we did the original survey in 2006 and found that there's actually good evidence still left and in place and intact from the early parts of this community. And you can see also that this dotted line here is the original grade of the original ground surface. And there's just been a lot of fill that's developed over time as we try to raise the banks of the bayou to try to keep the city from flooding. It was a bayou, and obviously it still wants to be from time to time. We just went through that. But that also means that in areas like this central area, the deposits are only 2 to 3 feet below the ground surface, the current ground surface. And as you get closer to the bayou, they can be 8, 10, 12 feet below the current ground surface, which impacts how you can excavate them to stay within OSHA safety standards. And we'll see kind of an example of that in a minute. So some of what we're finding help us to know a little bit more about the early community. And coins are good. They give you a nice date. This one came out of the ground like this. But then I wrapped it in aluminum foil, dropped it in some vinegar for a couple days. I worked at the conservation lab here at A&M, conserving artifacts from the Belle, the shipwreck, LaSalle shipwreck off Matagorda Bay, teaching me how to do things like this. So it comes out actually much nicer, and we can actually read the date of 1838, and that gives us maybe some clue of the time period that the area that this was found in dates to, or the artifacts that are associated it might date to. and some other early artifacts. This is a toothpick holder. And it dates to, its origins are from Germany. There's marks on the bottom that will tell us that. An early hand-painted marble. Decorated pottery can tell us a lot about how old something is, because those patterns changed through time. Often, and sometimes on the bottom of the pottery, you'll have what's called a maker's mark, and if we know something about the particular manufacturer, we can even read some of these things so that there's kind of a code here, but that'll tell us the year it was manufactured, the month it was manufactured. Oftentimes the factory is manufactured in, what batch it might have been from. So we can get very specific in terms of when a particular plate, for example, was manufactured. Other times they have less information on the maker's mark, but these change. Companies have changed these every few years. So by knowing, and there are kind of reference guides that we can go by checking something like this out, we can also tell how old something might be. And this is a bone handle from a straight razor. And the name on this, which I'm not reading right now, but we traced it to a pharmacy in San Antonio. So it kind of shows connections to other areas of the state. A hand-blown inkwell, buttons, a lot of shell, mother of pearl, hand-carved. And then we have some things that go up through the 1950s as well. So in some areas, we're getting a lot of mixed deposits, things that for 100 years, materials are all kind of jumbled up together. But in other areas, we're finding very intact deposits. And we can tell stories or understand a little bit more about the community as we're finding some of these objects. For example, this bottle of Mexican Mustang. It's a small liniment bottle, and this tells us a little bit of kind of what these, tells us something about the person that would have used this, ailments they may have had or something that they're trying to cure. It also tells us a little bit about the country and what it was like here before the FDA, where you could basically sell anything to anyone that they would buy. Mexican Mustang, with the slogan, "So long as human ills endures and morals suffer pain, so long shall Mustang liniment its glorious name remain." Well, human ills still exist, but the FDA got rid of Mexican Mustang, so this was false. They claimed that it would not only worked on men and women, but also recommended for children, horses, and domestic animals. So you could drink this or rub it on really any man or beast, and it would work equally well for a number of ailments. And it was equal parts crude oil, petroleum, olive oil, and carbonate of ammonia, with the directions to shake and mix very well. Make sure you mix it well. I'm not sure that this cured anything, but a couple sips of this and you would probably lie and say that it did, just so you wouldn't have to have any more of it. In a sense, it worked. So we're finding artifacts, but also a number of features. Features are not single objects. They're usually compilations of things or things that can't be carried off and still retain their meaning. And you can think of like the bricks of an old herringbone sidewalk, for example. Every one of the bricks is itself an artifact, but the sidewalk itself is a feature. Finding tracks from the old rail yard. The brick foundations of an old chimney base, and then on either side of it, we found the pier supports for the house structure that was around it. You can see pier supports right here. And then another interesting feature that we have two examples of. This is the worst of the two, where you can see these kind of white circles right here. It's a bottle alignment. Here's an example of the best of the two. So this tradition is German in its origins, and it dates to the middle part of the 19th century, but persisted up until the 20th century. What German families, some, would do is, upon emptying a bottle, They were Germans. They weren't going to put a full bottle in the ground. But upon emptying it, would tip it upside down. And again, these are, some of them are stoneware, some of them are glass, but different colors, so ornamental in a sense. And they would line walkways or backyard planter boxes or gardens with them. They became decorative elements. And so we have the remnants of one right here. And we can see this is in Louisiana, where this is a garden, and you can see the bottles kind of lining all kind of the garden areas. It was a decorative element. I'm not sure what brought about the end of this tradition. I'm betting it had something to do with a motorized lawnmower, but it didn't last very long into the 20th century. But one of the bottles in particular that we found, and these are some hand-blown wine bottles, and stoneware mineral water bottles imported from Germany. So the first German settlers here still imported a lot of materials from Germany, of goods from Germany, kept parts of the homeland. But this bottle is interesting. It's the original Budweiser bottle, but not Anheuser-Busch. C.C. & Co., Budweiser, dates 1876 to 1883. Carl Conrad, C.C., went over to Belgium, learned the craft of beer making, came back with this recipe, hired a number of companies to produce bottles for him, and hired a friend of his, last name Anheuser, to brew this beer for him using his recipe. And for a number of years, he was successful, and this beer made all the way out to California. It was very popular in Houston. Eventually, he went bankrupt in 1883, sold the rights, the patent rights and the name to Anheuser-Busch, continued working for them as a brewmaster for the next 20 years. And so the original labels from 1876 to 1878 look like this, up to 79 look like this, and see they change through time. So in this period, Conrad clearly no longer owned the company, but they still kept the CC on it. And in fact, they didn't take the CC, Anheuser-Busch didn't take the CC out of the crest right here until 1921. In fact, up until 1918, they still kept sort of the German double eagle on it. And so the bottle that we found, and then similar to the plates, the maker's mark, the stamp on the bottom also changed through time. So what we found was this bottle, you can see the red label right here, which is this, which dates to this labeling pattern right here, and then it had this bottom on it. So we know that it dated 1878 to about 1879. So that puts a minimum date. It could have been produced any time after this, but they probably didn't keep the bottle around for too long before they put it in the ground. So it gives us kind of a time period for this tradition and for this feature. Other interesting features are cisterns, underground water storage. And these were very important in Houston. The Sanborn fire insurance maps up until 1885 actually plotted where all the cisterns in the city were located, because there were a lot of fires in Houston and everything was made out of wood. And the fire companies needed to know where these cisterns were to actually tap into them whenever there was a fire. The next set of Sanborn maps that come out, 1891, don't have the cisterns plotted because between 1885 and 1891, the city went on municipal water. Or they discovered deep underground aquifers in Houston that a private company tapped into, and the city laid out water lines so everybody could have access to it. It didn't cut down cholera and dysentery quite as much as you would think, and the water was said to be putrid. And the company swore that they weren't cutting the aquifer water with Buffalo Bayou water, yet they couldn't explain the fact that in the city fire hydrants, whenever the fire company had to tap into them, occasionally fish would come out of them. That stopped in the early part of the 20th century when the city of Houston took over that company and cut the line to Buffalo Bayou and just used the aquifer. It also cut down on dysentery. But these cisterns, these water holding tanks, which is what people originally used, you would have water filter off your roof down through some pipes into this underground water storage. And that's what you use for your cooking, your drinking water, everything else. After people got municipal water, right around 1890 or within that time frame, these became garbage dumps. You didn't need it anymore for water. You just kind of tapped into something. So people would throw refuse in here. So what we're finding in cisterns is an accumulation of trash, but it doesn't date to when the cistern was built, rather when it dates to the time period that it was still open or remained open after the family that lived at that area got municipal water. But what we're finding is very interesting. We've found 2 wooden cisterns. They're made out of cedar wood, and they date to the period between 1875 to about 1910, when the cypress industry in East Texas was booming, and really there were 4 companies in Houston just this one year that were advertising cypress wood cisterns. And this one, the first one we found, we had nothing left of it except for the iron kind of bands that hold the cistern together. The wood had completely rotted out. The second one, the wood was completely intact because it was coated on the outside and in with pitch, kind of tar, which could not have improved the taste of the water probably in it, but it did keep the wood from decaying. And the artifacts in this one it's 4 feet tall, and it is filled with artifacts. We only excavated half of it, and probably close to 10,000 artifacts came out of it. The reason we found it to begin with was because it's actually fairly close to the bayou. So we had discovered earlier another not wooden but brick cistern, much more common type, but it's 8 feet below ground. So in order to excavate that and be compliant with OSHA, we had to open up a big excavation trench of a really wide area. And that's when we discovered this stain that we didn't know about before, and it turned out to be the cistern. Some of the things that we find in cisterns are interesting in and of themselves. You can tell a little bit about people using eyedroppers, Angostura bitters. This is interesting, a Palmolive token. You could trade this token in for a free bar of Palmolive, and why wouldn't you do that? Because who wants to fade at 30? And even some of the elements of the cistern are interesting. Houston is set on clay. And what clay has a tendency to do, particularly this kind of clay, is shrink in the summers when it dries up and expand in the rainy season. And what that has to do, that has a very bad effect on brittle solids. So a lot of the cisterns, when you had a bad designer who, first thing is you dig a big hole for the cistern, and then you build the cistern inside, and then you have what's called a builder's trench, which is the space between the outer edge of the cistern and the hole that you dug. And if you're good, you fill that in with dirt. But it's more expensive because you have to bring that in. If you're bad, then you fill it in with the clay that you just excavated out, which shrinks and swells and cracks your cistern. So most of the cisterns that we found are cracked or had cracked. And if you had a good repairer, what they do is they score the sides on the inside of the cistern. They score the sides. So you see all these little hatch marks. Those are like hammer marks, because that means when they replaster it, it adheres to the wall. If they're bad, they don't do that, and the new plaster just peels off. The other thing that we found in absolutely every cistern, wooden or brick, is shoes for some reason. If anybody knows any folk customs about throwing shoes in a cistern, please see me after this. We found another cistern also as part of this project, but actually not in Frosttown. Frosttown is this area here, and so when we build the viaduct, it's going to be at a modern safety standard, so it's going to be a little bit wider, I think about 14 feet or so. So we're acquiring some property just to the east of the roadway now, and in so doing, we found another cistern. So if you take an aerial photograph and you overlay the 1885 Sanborn map, you can see this circle, that's a cistern, that's a cistern, that's a cistern, and that's exactly where we found it. So probably should have known it was going to be there. So Textile purchased this meth lab, something, and it was actually under this shed. This house is in its original position, but originally there's a kind of a wing coming off, and so the cistern is right here. Right after the Great Fire of 1912, and this is the Great Fire of 1912, the whole Fifth Ward burned down. They separated this lot, so another house got put on top of it, and a backyard shed was put over where the cistern was. Essentially, I've determined the cistern probably dates to about 1885, 84, because it doesn't show up on the 1882, 83 Houston City Directory. Nobody's living at that address. But on the 1885 Sanborn map, someone is living there. It's 1885 there, so you can see the house and the cistern. So no one was there in 1883. House with a cistern there in 1885. 1884 is a good time. But the 1891 Sanborn map shows that they had city water. So the cistern was actually only in use for less than a decade before they got city water. And it looks like it was completely capped off. And so this is how we found it. It was just kind of this round hole in the ground, and we weren't really sure. That's not like a cistern, so I wasn't sure what was going on. And what actually happened was after the Great Fire, they didn't spend the money to bring fill in and fill the cistern. What they did instead is just put a brick and cement cap over it. So we had a great little time capsule there. It wasn't filled in with stuff like all the other cisterns that we found. Even with those, you can usually tell what the original stuff was. It's in this kind of blackish goo at the bottom that smells pretty bad. And then there's kind of mixed sand and clay and stuff above it. But this one had nothing above it. It was completely empty, with the exception of being capped off on the top. So we had kind of a narrow little time capsule that we could find out a little bit more about the people that lived kind of in the Fifth Ward, which nobody writes about. So to excavate this, because Pruitt & Associates, our contractor, was busy excavating Frosttown, and I didn't want to bring them off that for this kind of small project, I got TxDOT to agree to execute a cooperative, let the Houston Archaeological Society volunteer. Houston Archaeological Society is one of the most active avocational volunteer archaeological groups in the entire state. And they've helped me on past projects, and they were very eager to help me on this one. So here we are excavating kind of the sludge that was left in the bottom, and some of the things that we found, buttons, these are all lead, everything from a tie tack to a wire crimp, an old razor, a cufflink, a gold earring, again, shoes. The one thing that could be dated from, the one thing that actually had a firm date of anything in there was a garter belt hook. Boston Garter Company, it had the patent number on it, which dates to his Boston Garter Company here. So by having the patent number, we were able to trace it to a pattern that was only made between 1892 and 1895, which is interesting because we also found like a number of pins, like lots of pins, sewing kits, thimbles. And between 1892 and 1893, a widow, Lucy Richardson, who was a dressmaker, lived actually in that house. So she was probably the first person living there after it went on to city water, and she would have been the first person probably to throw things in there, also ladies' shoes. So interesting tie-in. The other thing that the cistern had, which is completely unique to Texas, we have not ever found another one of these documented anywhere in the state. The brick mason signed his name, scrawled it into the plaster on the inside, M. Bow, Natchez, Mississippi. It's actually J.M. Bow, but the J.M., James, was not very good at building cisterns. One of the state archaeologists, Mark Denton, who studied cisterns across Texas, noticed very quickly that this is the least round cistern that he had ever seen. James eyeballed this one. I don't think he measured anything. It was kind of amorphous going all the way up and had many cracks, and one of them actually covered part of his name, so it was J.M. Bow. So we found J.M. Bow in Natchez, Mississippi in the 1860 census. Well, it turns out that he's buried in Houston in Glenwood Cemetery. He died, you find out when he died in 1903 on April 9th. Born in Natchez, Mississippi on August 11th, 1833. Left his wife, children, came to the city in about 1865 and started building cisterns. In fact, he shows up in the city directories every year as a brick mason, with the exception of 2 years. And what's important to understand about that is his son actually became very involved in city government and became quite important in the city of Houston. So 1 year, Bow shows up as the sewer inspector, the city sewer inspector, and another year he shows up as the brick streets inspector, but he doesn't keep either of those positions for more than a year because the next city directory shows him back as being a brick mason. And if the quality of the build on this cistern is any indication, I don't think he can keep a job. We tried to locate descendants of Bow so they could maybe see something that their great-great-grandfather had built, but sadly, he had daughters that either had children that died in infancy, or they didn't have children at all, and like his son had a child. The family line sort of died out. In fact, his son, William, who became important in Houston, died in an insane asylum back in Mississippi. Drinking too much of the Houston water, maybe. So the Houston Archaeological Society has been amazing in helping TxDOT for this project and others. They're a constant resource that we can rely on, and one of the things that they're also helping us with is interviewing some of sort of the last living people that lived in Frosttown, actually Barrio Alacran, and Sergio Garcia is one of them. He was born in Barrio Alacran. In 1931, he lived there up until 1944, when his father got a job at Rice Institute, and then he moved out of it. But from these people, we have 12 more people to interview that are going to tell us a little bit more about early life there. They're putting a context that would otherwise be impossible to get onto the artifacts that we're finding. Sergio tells us that both Spanish and English were spoken in the neighborhood. Most residents were laborers and unskilled workers. Water was supplied by a single faucet on the outside of the house. Also, people came by, there was a cart that came by once a week to empty out the outhouse, and Frosttown had those up until the 70s. People were still using outhouses. So there's a great contrast between downtown Houston, major metropolitan modern city, and just a couple blocks away, an area where people are still using outhouses. Many people had a wire hanging from the ceiling of the kitchen from which they hung food so that rodents or pests couldn't get to it overnight. This is the kind of, at the end, the German houses that all fallen and disappeared and been replaced mostly by shacks like this. These are all from Barrio Alacran. And you can see that it's a very poor working class neighborhood at this point. What we are attempting to do with this project is provide a more complete history of Houston. You don't read about any of the people that lived in this area throughout any of its history. When you read about the history of Houston, you read about the people that owned land, you read about the people that owned businesses. You don't read about the laborers, the people that came from other countries that worked in the lumberyard or the cotton compress or in the railroad, that then worked their way up through the city by volunteering for things like the light guard, like Bow's son William did. Today, Houston is known as the most diverse large city in the country. We have one of the largest and most diverse ethnic groups. We're recognized as having that of any large city in the country. That's not anything new. Houston's been that from the start. It's always been an area, it's always been a place where people from other parts of the country or other parts of the world could come to work, to find opportunity, to make a better life for themselves. And it's got some great stories, everything from the original Budweiser to very bad cistern builders. We can look at the artifacts to see how long it took early immigrants to assimilate into the United States by seeing when they stopped buying or importing stuff from Germany and started just using local materials. And we can see what, in tracking, one of the things that we're doing now is also looking at old deed records and ad valorem tax records to find out actually who lived in each one of these lots, when they lived there, and what period of time, to track individuals, to track them ethnically, to track family groups and where they might have gone in the city from here, to see how people, the whole life cycle, the whole life history, and what opportunities came out of Frosttown, where people went from here, or what this allowed them to do, and how this changed through time with increased industrialization, with demographic changes. And what we're doing is giving a more complete history to Houston. It's not just the people that owned the businesses. It's the people that worked in the businesses that made Houston what it is today. And this is exactly what happened last time I gave this talk. I forgot to drink water. So right now, we've completed one phase of the data recovery, the major excavations. We haven't excavated in areas, important areas, that are beneath roadways or right up to the bridge columns, because we didn't want to destabilize an ongoing, a roadway that was being used. That'd be bad. But since it's mostly demolished now, we could actually get in there, but we have to wait until that area's closed off for demolition and the roadway, the existing roads are scraped off so we can get in there and finish the archaeology. Originally, the plan was that when the demolition started, they were going to demo the archaeology, the part of the bridge over the archaeological area first, so we could finish up, and then they could go back and, while they were demolishing everything else, we'd be out of their way, and then they can go back and do whatever they want. Somehow, that's turned into demolishing our area last, so most of the rest of the viaduct has already been demolished, and we're waiting for the archaeology the area that's over Frosttown to be demolished so we can go back in and finish that up. I think what they've told us now is we might be able to get onto it in November, but there's one more phase of the archaeology left to kind of tie everything together. And then it'll be a few years while we're processing the artifacts. I'm going out to Riverside campus tomorrow morning to see the first batch of artifacts that we've put through conservation, to see how those have come out. And then sometime a few more years down the road, we'll have a report out so you could read about the complete history of Houston. Thanks.